Take a step forward and walk into the unknown. The path ahead is shrouded in mist, but with each step, new secrets will be revealed. Echoes of the past will whisper in your ear, and perhaps you'll realize that the line between reality and myth isn't as clear as you once thought. The story begins. Centuries after the Great Ruin, one of the ancient caves remained sealed, but one night a bright light split the sky, illuminating the cave's entrance. From that moment on, the tribes living in the forest began hearing the same voice in their dreams. Come. No one knew the source of the call, but there was one who dared to follow it. Orun, a hunter cast out by his tribe. His past was filled with hidden secrets and unanswered questions. He decided to uncover the mystery of the cave. As he moved past ancient stone monuments and skeletons carved with strange symbols, he reached the entrance of the cave. The air suddenly turned cold. Just as Orun was about to step forward, he sensed movement behind him. Turning quickly, he spotted a tall, slender figure emerging from the shadows. The stranger wore a tattered but once regal cloak. His face was hidden behind a mask. "Everyone who comes here dies," the stranger said, his voice deep and resonant. "But you heard the call, didn't you? Just like I did." Orun reached for his dagger. "Who are you?" The stranger tilted his head slightly. "You may not remember me, but we share the same fate." A distant memory flickered in Orun's mind. A figure from his childhood. He had seen this stranger before. But where? At that moment, the hum from within the cave grew stronger. Something was awakening inside. Orun stepped into the cave, following the stranger. The air changed instantly. Despite the cold wind outside, the inside was filled with an unnatural warmth. The cave walls shimmered with ancient symbols carved by lost tribes. The stranger walked forward with slow, deliberate steps. As Orun followed, the humming inside the cave grew louder. It almost sounded like whispers, though the language was impossible to understand. After a while, a faint blue light seeped through the cracks in the cave ceiling. The stranger stopped for a moment, then turned his head toward Orun. "The last person to come here heard the call. Just like you," he said, in a deep voice. "But they never returned." Orun narrowed his eyes. "Did you?" The stranger remained silent for a moment. "Some things never truly return, Orun." Something about those words unsettled Orun. They walked a few more steps before arriving at a vast open chamber. In front of them lay a stone bridge stretching into the depths of the cave. At the far end of the bridge stood a massive door. Its surface was cracked, and a faint red light pulsed from within. Orun carefully observed the surroundings. The stone floor was littered with ancient weapons, broken bones, and strange masks. At that moment, the humming inside the cave turned into a scream. The sound echoed inside Orun's mind, causing a brief dizziness. The stranger, however, stood completely still. "It's time to open the door," the stranger said, raising his hands. The symbols around the door began to glow. Orun instinctively stepped back. A deep feeling stirred inside him. Something was behind that door, and it should not be released. Orun's instincts screamed that this was wrong. The symbols on the door glowed brighter, and the red light inside pulsed with increasing intensity. "You must not do this," he shouted, lunging forward. The stranger seemed unprepared for Orun's sudden attack. He swung his dagger, aiming for the figure's chest. The blade sliced through the cloak, but Orun felt nothing. The stranger's body was not made of flesh. It was like striking a shadow. For a brief moment, Orun hesitated. That was his mistake. The stranger's hand struck his chest, sending him flying backward. Orun crashed onto the stone floor, gasping for air. "The door will open, Orun. You cannot stop it." The stranger's voice had changed. It was deeper, more resonant, layered with voices that were not his own. Orun forced himself to stand. The door trembled. The red cracks pulsed, waves of light spreading through the cavern. But Orun was not giving up. He grabbed a loose stone from the ground and hurled it at the brightest symbol on the door. A shockwave rippled through the cave. A scream echoed from within. The stranger stumbled backward, recoiling as if in pain. "What have you done?" the figure shouted. The symbols on the door began to fade. Orun realized he had disrupted the ritual. Wasting no time, he grabbed an old sword lying on the cave floor and struck another symbol. With the second blow, the entire cave shook. The stranger lost his footing and fell. Then, the humming inside the door stopped. Something inside had retreated. But the danger was far from over. The cave was collapsing. The cave was falling apart. The ceiling cracked, sending down chunks of rock. The ground trembled beneath Orun's feet. There was no time to waste. He had to escape, now. The stranger was still on the ground, clutching his chest. But Orun had no time to focus on him. Survival was all that mattered. He turned and sprinted toward the exit. The ground beneath him cracked with each step. Behind him, a deep, guttural wail echoed from within the cave. Whatever was behind the door was still there, but it had weakened. As Orun crossed the stone bridge, a massive pillar collapsed with a deafening crash. He had to make it out before everything came down, but just as he neared the entrance, the ground split open in front of him. A massive chasm yawned wide. One wrong step, and he'd fall into the abyss. Orun didn't rush. Instead of making a reckless move, he approached the edge of the chasm and carefully examined his surroundings. Amidst the dust and debris, he spotted a small ledge just a few meters below, a rocky outcrop that could serve as a foothold. If he could carefully lower himself down, he might be able to use it to reach the other side. The cave shook violently, stones crashing around him. He had to move fast. Taking a deep breath, he slid downward, bracing himself for impact. As his feet hit the outcrop, his balance wavered, the loose rocks crumbled beneath him. But just in time, he grabbed onto a jagged edge, steadying himself. One thought echoed in his mind. If I don't make it out, this is where it ends. Just as he prepared to climb back up, a sound from behind made his blood run cold. The stranger was following him, but something about him was wrong. His body flickered like a shadow, parts of him vanishing and reappearing. "Do you really think you stopped me, Orun?" the stranger whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally. "This door will open. If you escape now, you will never truly be free. None of us will." Orun stared as the stranger's eyes glowed a deep, unnatural red. His options were limited. Orun ignored the stranger's words. Survival was all that mattered now. He pressed his hands against the rocky edge and began climbing with all his strength. His feet scrambled against the loose stones, feeling the instability of the ground beneath him. Every second, the cave came closer to total collapse. Behind him, the stranger moved unnaturally. His body flickered, dissolving into a dark, shifting haze. "Do you really think escaping will save you?" the voice whispered, now more of a deep, distorted echo than a human tone. Orun launched himself upward with one final push. At the same moment, a massive rumble shook the cave. The section where the door stood collapsed, sending a cloud of dust billowing into the air. Orun sprinted forward without stopping. The exit was just a few meters away. Daylight flickered ahead like a beacon of hope. With a final leap, he hurled himself outside, rolling onto the dirt just as the cave's entrance crumbled behind him with a deafening crash. He gasped for breath, his chest rising and falling rapidly. But he was alive. He knelt at the cave's entrance, staring at the ruins. The door was sealed. The stranger was gone. Yet something felt unfinished. Deep inside, he knew whatever was behind that door wasn't gone forever. But would it return? Or had this only delayed the inevitable? Orun remained kneeling at the entrance of the cave, his lungs burning with exhaustion. The door was shut. But was he truly safe? To find out, he decided to stay close. If something was still inside, he needed to be the first to notice. He hid behind a rocky outcrop, watching the sealed entrance. As night fell, the cave remained silent. No movement, no energy, no sounds. But in the middle of the night, a strange wind blew. The air turned cold. For a brief moment, a faint red shimmer flickered between the cracks of the collapsed stone. Orun wasn't sure if it was real, but deep inside, his instincts told him this wasn't over. By morning, he knew there was no point in waiting longer. The cave was silent, for now, but would it stay that way? He had to take this warning back to his tribe. Orun set off toward his tribe, trekking for days through the wilderness. He survived by foraging and following old hunting trails. But something was different. Every night, the same dream haunted him. Red eyes, a hollow voice, and the same chilling words repeated over and over. "I am coming." When Orun finally reached his village, his mind was clouded. He had to warn them, but how would they believe him? As he stepped past the tribe's borders, the first person he saw was the old shaman, Orun. "We thought you were dead," the shaman said. "But we have been waiting for you. 3 nights ago, we all had the same dream." Orun felt his blood freeze. The shaman's eyes locked onto his. "What have you done, Orun? Why did you wake it up?" Orun took a deep breath. There was no point in hiding the truth. If his tribe was in danger, he needed to prepare them. The shaman's eyes remained locked onto him. The tribe members slowly gathered around, listening carefully. The cave was opening. Orun said, his voice firm. "Someone or something wanted that door to open. I did everything I could to stop it, but I don't know exactly what I prevented from escaping." Whispers spread through the tribe. Some took a step back in fear, while others waited for the shaman's response. "And now it's in our dreams," Orun continued. "This means the danger isn't over. If the door opens again, will we be able to stop it?" The shaman closed his eyes, staying silent for a moment. His expression was full of deep concern. Finally he spoke. "You are not the only one who heard the call, Orun. 3 nights ago, all the elders had the same dream. Red eyes, an echoing voice, and something approaching." The shaman took a deep breath and turned toward the great totem standing at the center of the village. "We all know that ancient beings were sealed in these lands, but this is not the first time someone has heard their call." The tribe grew even more uneasy. "Then what do we do?" Orun asked. "We must prepare," the shaman said. "But first, we must know what we're facing." Orun narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" The shaman leaned on his staff, stepping closer. "The knowledge that could protect us was lost long ago. If we are to face this threat, we must find it again." Orun had no idea where to start looking, but the shaman turned his gaze east and said, "Beyond the Ashen Valley there were once those who held this knowledge. Their descendants may still live. You must go there and uncover the truth." Orun weighed the shaman's words. Defending this village was crucial, but without ancient knowledge it would be a battle against time. They couldn't fight what they didn't understand. "I will go," he finally said. "I will travel to the Ashen Valley and find the truth." The shaman nodded. "Then be careful, Orun. What awaits you there is not just knowledge, but forgotten things as well." The next morning, Orun prepared for his journey. A light yet sturdy armor, a good hunting blade, and a water skin. The journey would be long, but his greatest uncertainty was not the road, but what lay beyond the valley. As he took his first steps, the village watched in silence. Some whispered among themselves, was he a hero or a fool? But Orun didn't care. He turned east and stepped into the unknown. For the first 2 days, Orun's journey was uneventful. He hunted during the day and navigated by the stars at night. But on the 3rd day, something changed. The air suddenly fell silent. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves vanished, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Orun immediately became cautious. The trees around him bore strange carvings, symbols etched into their bark. A warning? Just then a rustling sound came from his right. A shadow moved between the trees. Orun froze, gripping his dagger. Was it a wild beast? Or was something watching him? Orun froze in place, steadying his breath. A reckless move would make him prey. Slowly he pressed his back against the tree, making himself smaller, less visible. His hand rested on his dagger, but he didn't draw it. He wouldn't strike first. A faint footstep echoed through the forest. Someone was watching him. But this was not the movement of a wild beast. This was a person. 2 figures emerged from the trees. The first was tall, clad in tattered leather. An old rusted metal mask covered his face. The second was smaller but sharp-eyed, scanning the area with practiced precision. The first man spoke in a hushed tone. "Someone's here. I heard. Footsteps. Orun held his breath. The second man stepped closer, his gaze sweeping the area. Orun's mind raced. If he stayed hidden too long, they might find him. But revealing himself was also risky. Who were they? Wanderers crossing his path, or something worse? Orun waited for a few heartbeats. How far could he go by hiding? If these men were truly enemies, he would have to fight or flee. But if they weren't, then provoking a needless conflict would be foolish. He made his decision. Stepping out of the shadows, he kept his hands at his sides, making no sudden moves. If I am not your friend, I am not your enemy either. His voice was steady. I have nothing to hide. The two men reacted immediately. The taller one half drew an old sword, keeping it at the ready. The shorter one studied Orun like a hunter assessing prey. A moment of silence passed. Are you alone? The masked man asked. Orun nodded. I'm heading to the Ashen Valley. My path takes me through here. The shorter man smirked. No one travels that way alone. Either you're a fool or... Or what? Orun asked. Or you know exactly what you're looking for. The taller man locked his masked gaze onto Orun. You have a reason for being here. Will you share it with us? Orun had few options, but revealing too much without understanding their true intentions could be dangerous. Orun couldn't fully read the stranger's intentions. Revealing too much could be a mistake, but staying silent might make them suspicious, so he chose a careful path. I seek knowledge, he said, locking eyes with the masked man. Lost things from the past. I heard some of that knowledge still exists in the Ashen Valley. He didn't say more. The masked man remained silent for a moment, as if weighing Orun's words, measuring the truth behind them. What kind of knowledge? The shorter man asked. Magic or secrets of the past? Orun shrugged. Maybe both. The shorter man smirked. But there was something strange in that smirk, like he already knew the answer. The masked man nodded. People. Like you are rare, Orun frowned. What do you mean? This forest isn't silent for no reason, the masked man said, and if you don't know exactly what you seek, the Ashen Valley will consume you. Orun now understood. These men knew something, but could they be trusted? That was still uncertain. Orun realized these men were no ordinary travelers. Their silence, their words, they knew more than they let on. He couldn't ignore it. He stepped forward and asked directly, Who are you and how do you know so much about the Ashen Valley? The shorter man smirked slightly. A traveler who asks questions, interesting. Most just walk forward and meet their fate. That's not an answer, Orun replied firmly. The masked man finally spoke. Forget us. What matters is this. Why do you seek this knowledge? Orun hesitated. He was at a crossroads. If he told them about his dreams and what had happened in the cave, they might be willing to help. But if they were the wrong kind of people, they could use that knowledge against him. One thing was certain. These men knew things that normal people wouldn't. Orun carefully chose his words. I was told that something is coming. I see it in my dreams. The only way to stop it is to learn the past. At those words, the two men exchanged a brief glance. The shorter man spat on the ground and shook his head. We're already late, he muttered. Orun frowned. What do you mean? The masked man stepped forward, locking eyes with Orun. Listen, traveler. If your dreams are real and something is truly coming, then in the Ashen Valley you won't just find answers. You'll find death. A chill ran down Orun's spine. Orun's instincts told him not to trust these men completely, but at the same time, traveling alone would be even riskier. If the Ashen Valley was truly deadly, he couldn't afford to be alone. Taking a deep breath, he locked eyes with the masked man. If death waits for me there, at least I want to know how I'll die. The masked man's gaze narrowed slightly. You want to travel with us? You know more about the Ashen Valley than I do, Orun replied. If danger awaits, I'd rather face it knowing what I'm up against. Let's be allies. The shorter man chuckled. You've got courage, traveler, but we'll see if it saves you. Or kills you. The masked man stared at Orun for a moment, then nodded slightly. Fine, but on one condition. If a decision needs to be made, you will follow our lead. Orun hesitated briefly, then nodded. "I accept." And so, an unexpected alliance was formed. As they traveled, the air grew colder. Days ago, this forest had been warm and humid, but now a strange mist clung to the trees. After some time, the shorter man finally introduced himself. "You can call me Ravik," he said with a grin, "but my name doesn't matter. What matters is which of us makes it to the end." The masked man never gave his name. "Who I am isn't important. What I know is." During their journey, Orun tried to learn who these men really were and why they knew so much about the Ashen Valley, but they always avoided his questions. One night, as they set up camp, Orun noticed strange blue lights flickering in the distance. Ravik scowled at the sight. "This might be worse than I thought," he muttered. Orun couldn't help but ask what the blue lights were. For the first time, the masked man looked genuinely tense. "They might be the cursed guardians of the Ashen Valley." Cold chill crept into Orun's bones. Orun locked his eyes on the blue lights. They moved like flames in the wind, flickering in a strange rhythmic pattern. Ravik's unease proved he recognized them. "What are they, Ravik?" Orun asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and caution. Ravik hesitated, then let out a slow breath. His tone grew serious. "They are living spirits, the watchers of the Ashen Valley." Orun frowned. "Spirits? Human spirits?" "Yeah and no," the masked man replied. "They are neither fully alive nor fully dead. Long ago, after a great catastrophe, some spirits became bound to this place. There is no way to set them free. They guard the valley's borders. If you get too close, they may pull you in." A cold shiver ran through Orun's body. "Do they attack?" Ravik let out a dry chuckle, but there was no amusement in it. "Attack? No. They don't want to kill you, but if you enter their space, they will strip you of your soul. Your body will remain, but you will become one of them," Orun thought carefully. If they were traveling to the Ashen Valley, they needed to know how to deal with these beings. "Is there a way to escape them?" The masked man gave a slow nod. "Not escape, trick. They cannot see nor hear, but they can feel energy. If they sense fear, they will never let you go." Orun instinctively controlled his breathing. Fear, that would be his greatest enemy. But knowing about these spirits wasn't enough. He had to see them up close. "I'm going to get a closer look," Ravik immediately objected. "That's madness. If they notice you, there's no coming back." Orun looked at Ravik calmly but firmly. "If we want to survive the Ashen Valley, we need to understand our enemy." With that, he slowly moved toward the lights. Orun moved silently toward the lights. As he got closer, he realized they didn't stay in one place. They floated, shifting like lost souls. But the strangest thing was how the air itself changed as he approached. It was as if the world had gone completely silent. He took another step forward. A whisper echoed in his ears. "Turn back." Orun froze. The voice was inside his mind. Yet, it felt so real. He took another step, and suddenly, the blue lights turned. Toward him? Then, right in front of him, a figure appeared. Tall, thin, featureless. But it had eyes. Two glowing blue flames. Orun stood frozen. "You," the being whispered, its voice an ancient echo. "Can you hear us?" Orun had to decide. Orun's instincts told him to retreat. He still didn't fully understand what this entity was, but one thing was certain. It had noticed him. The figure, its glowing blue eyes like twin flames, stared into Orun as if peering into his very soul. "You hear us?" it whispered, its voice scattering like wind-blown echoes. Orun steadied his breath and took a slow step backward. If he moved too, fast the entity might sense his fear and follow. Silent, controlled. Another step, the entity did not move. Another step. The blue lights flickered slightly, but the figure remained still. Finally, after a few more paces, it faded into the mist. Orun took a deep breath and returned to Ravik and the masked man. Ravik frowned. "You saw it, didn't you?" Orun nodded. "It noticed me," the masked man spoke in a cold tone. "But it did not follow." Orun locked eyes with them. "No, but now it knows we're here." Ravik scowled. "If one of them noticed, the others will too. Traveling through the valley just got more dangerous." That was a warning. Orun briefly recalled the red eyes from his dreams. Were they connected to these entities? He didn't know, but he had to find out. Orun sat by the fire, staring at Ravik and the masked man. One thing was clear. These men knew more than any normal traveler should, and now that the blue lights had noticed them, knowing the truth was a matter of survival. What exactly are these entities? Orun demanded, his voice firmer than ever. Ravik and the masked man exchanged a glance. Knowing won't make you safer, the masked man replied coldly. Orun didn't back down. Not knowing will get me killed. So talk. Ravik raised an eyebrow and chuckled. Fine, but what we're about to tell you might disturb you. And so they revealed the Ashen Valley's oldest secret. Thousands of years ago, long before even the Great Ruin, this land was home to a great civilization. They had unlocked secrets that no others had, but one day, they made a fatal mistake. The Ashen Valley was once sacred, a resting ground for the dead. But that civilization tried to cheat death. They sought to trap souls inside bodies, and one day, they succeeded. But the result was catastrophic. Their first failure caused souls to leave their bodies but never fully die. They became trapped between existence and oblivion, neither dead nor alive, and ever since, they have remained as the valley's cursed guardians. The blue lights were the spirits that guarded the valley's borders. If a traveler attracted their attention, they would try to make them one of their own. Orun tightened his fists. Then, is there a way to completely escape? Them? He asked. The masked man was silent for a long moment, then nodded. You can't escape them, but you can make them leave you alone. How? Follow us. We'll show you. Instead of heading directly to the Ashen Valley, Ravik and the masked man suggested an alternative route. The Shadow Pass is the safest way, Ravik explained. If we go that way, the blue lights won't sense us. Orun wasn't sure whether to trust this path, but he had no choice, and so they set off toward the Shadow Pass. But then something unexpected happened. Through the mist, a human-like figure appeared, but something was off. It didn't move like a normal person. Its body flickered slightly, shifting like an illusion. Then it spoke. You've chosen the wrong path. Orun's blood ran cold. Who was this? Orun's instincts screamed that facing this figure would be a mistake. It looked human, but its body flickered, shifting like an unstable mirage. This was not something real. Without a word, Orun shot a sharp glance at Ravik and the masked man. We're leaving. Ravik nodded without hesitation. The masked man lingered for a moment, observing the figure, but then followed Orun's lead. The three moved quickly and silently, altering their path. As they moved through the thick mist, Orun forced himself not to look back. It felt as if even a single glance would make the entity draw closer. Then, from behind them, a chilling whisper echoed, "You cannot escape." Orun's jaw clenched, but he didn't slow down. They picked up speed, pushing forward until finally, the mist began to thin. The figure did not follow, but deep inside, Orun knew it was still watching. After hours of travel, the group emerged into a more open area. The thick mist was now far behind them. Ravik exhaled deeply. I don't know what that thing was, but we made the right call. Orun remained deep in thought. Why did it just stand there? If it was a threat, why didn't it attack? The masked man answered in a quiet tone. Because we had to make a choice. If we had spoken, we wouldn't have known whether the conversation was happening in our world or in its world. Orun frowned. So it was. A doorway? The masked man gave a slow nod. Perhaps, and I am certain we did not want to step through it. Orun gazed at the sky in silence. There was still a long way to go before reaching the Ashen Valley, but dangers lurked in every shadow. And worst of all, this might only be the beginning. Orun pushed aside his unease. Instead of pressing forward immediately, they needed to rest. Both physically and mentally, they were drained. If they were truly heading toward the Ashen Valley, things would only get more dangerous. We camp here, he said firmly. Neither Ravik nor the masked man objected. They too were exhausted. They built a small fire, keeping the smoke low to avoid drawing attention. Orun still wasn't sure if the unknown figure was watching them, so caution was necessary. As they sat around the flames, Orun knew he couldn't wait any longer. "Tell me now," he said, his gaze locked on Ravik and the masked man. "You saw that thing. What do you think it was?" Ravik stared into the fire and shrugged. "Did you think this valley was only filled with the living?" "Not knowing is more dangerous than being afraid of the truth," Orun countered. The masked man finally broke his silence. "If we keep going deeper into the Ashen Valley, we won't just find lost spirits. There's a kind of time fracture here." Orun narrowed his eyes. "The time fracture," the masked man nodded. "Some things here are stuck between the past and the present. That figure we saw might have been an echo of someone who lived here." Orun noticed him hesitate. "Or?" The masked man tossed a stone into the fire, his voice colder than before. "Or it was an echo of someone who hasn't come here yet." Silence fell. Orun let the thought settle in his mind. Echoes of the past, trapped souls, and maybe glimpses of things that hadn't happened yet. If this was true, understanding anything in this valley would be nearly impossible. But one thing was certain. This was a place that could either change everything or destroy it all. Orun gazed at the sky. The clouds were heavy and dark. Even after all their conversations, the unease in his chest wouldn't fade. As Ravik and the masked man prepared to sleep, Orun's mind kept circling back to the figure. If it was an echo of the past, what did that mean? And if it was an echo of the future, why had it said, "You've chosen the wrong path"? As he tried to rest, something happened. In the distance, the blue lights reappeared. But this time, they were closer. Orun stood up immediately. This wasn't a coincidence. Orun didn't hesitate when he saw the blue lights appear near the camp. "Wake up," he whispered, lightly tapping Ravik and the masked man on the shoulder. Both men immediately awoke, scanning their surroundings. Their expressions grew serious as they spotted the blue lights. "They've returned," Ravik muttered, clenching his teeth. "What do they want this time?" The masked man remained calm. "Maybe they're just waiting. But if they're watching us, there must be a reason." Orun spoke without looking away from the lights. "We need to understand them, and the only way to do that is to get closer." Ravik raised an eyebrow. "Are you joking? These things don't like being noticed. If you approach them, they might not let you go." But deep inside, Orun felt something pulling him forward. Taking a deep breath, he slowly stepped toward the lights. Orun stepped beyond the edge of the camp, moving toward the lights. The mist wrapped around him like a cold veil. As he approached, the lights began to flicker. With each step, he felt the air grow heavier. Then the lights suddenly converged, forming a shape before him. A tall, thin figure appeared. Its face was indistinct, but its eyes burned like two bright blue flames. The entity remained still, staring at Orun. Then a voice echoed in his mind. "You do not belong here." Orun clenched his jaw, but didn't back away. "What are you?" he asked, his voice steady. The figure tilted, its head slightly. "You carry echoes of before. If you seek answers, are you ready to be sacrificed?" Orun felt the weight of the words deep in his mind, but he also sensed that this entity was testing him. Orun's instincts told him one thing: retreat. This entity was testing him, maybe even luring him into a trap. Orun carefully took a step back. The figure did not move. Another step. The glowing blue eyes remained locked onto him. "You retreat," the entity whispered, its voice light as the wind but deeply unsettling. "But it will not be enough." Orun clenched his teeth, steadying his breath. He couldn't let it sense his fear. He said nothing more and quietly stepped back toward the camp. As Orun reached the edge of the camp, Ravik and the masked man were still watching him. "You made it back," Ravik said, sounding both surprised and relieved. Orun nodded. "That thing, it spoke to me." The masked man turned toward him, his voice unreadable. "What did it say?" Orun hesitated for a moment. He needed to choose his words carefully. "It doesn't see me as belonging here." "But it also said this journey isn't over." Ravik scowled. "Great. So we have to keep moving forward without even knowing what we're dealing with." The masked man studied Orun intently. "Did you feel anything else?" Orun remembered the burning blue eyes, the echoing voice, And the strange feeling deep inside him, if these were just lost souls, why had they told him, "You carry echoes of before"? Was this about his past, or something else he had yet to understand? There were still too many unanswered questions, but one thing was certain. Traveling deeper into this valley would be no ordinary journey. Orun sat by the flickering firelight, staring at Ravik and the masked man. "Before we enter the valley, we need a plan." His voice was firm. "This place doesn't follow the rules of our world. One mistake could mean no return." Ravik sighed but nodded. "You're right, but we can't delay. Too long, those things noticed us. The longer we wait, the more attention we attract." The masked man spoke thoughtfully. "If we're truly going into the valley, we need rules. First rule, if we encounter the blue lights, we do not engage with them." Orun considered this. "But the entity that spoke to me, it had awareness. Maybe some of them can be reasoned with. Or maybe that will destroy you," Ravik said coldly. "You got lucky. Next time, you might not." Orun knew he had a point, but charging into the unknown blindly was just as dangerous. The masked man continued. "Second rule, time fractures exist here. If we encounter them, we do not step into them. If they show us something, we watch and learn, but we do not interfere." Orun nodded. This valley was unstable. If time truly bent here, they might see events from the past, or even glimpses of the future. "Final rule," Ravik added. "No matter what happens, we move as one. If someone gets lost, we don't go back for them. The lost must find their own way." That rule unsettled Orun, but he understood. If one of them vanished, the others couldn't risk being trapped too. The plan was set. It was time to move. At dawn, they packed up camp and set off. As they passed through the veil of mist, Orun felt a strange weight settle in his chest. It felt as if unseen eyes were watching them. As they neared the valley's entrance, the air began to shift. The wind carried a whispering hum. The trees had turned black. The ground was burned, charred like coal, and worst of all, the air was thick with sulfur and the scent of fire. "Welcome to the Ashen Valley," Ravik said dryly. Last chance to turn back, but none of them were turning back, and then a voice echoed through the valley. "We've been waiting for you." But there was no one in sight. A chill ran down Orun's spine. Now it had truly begun. When Orun heard the voice echo through the valley, something inside him told him to stop. "They've been waiting for us," he muttered. "That's either a trap or the start of something much bigger." Ravik nodded grimly. "Walking straight into it would be suicide. But we can't stay exposed out here either." Orun quickly scanned their surroundings. If they could find a vantage point to observe the valley before making a move, it could give them a major advantage. "We need high ground," the masked man said. "If this was once a city, some stone structures might still be standing." "Then we move now," Orun added. "We're not making any decisions until we know what we're dealing with." The group moved carefully, following the slope downward into the valley. As they passed through charred trees, the place felt eerily like an ancient battlefield. At one point, they found strange stone markers on the ground. Symbols were carved into them, letters none of them recognized. Ravik knelt beside one, running his fingers over the worn surface. These could be gravestones, but who or what was buried here? The thought sent a shiver down Orun's spine. Eventually, they reached a crumbling tower built on a rocky outcrop. It had likely been a watchtower long ago. Climbing to the top, they finally had a clear view of the valley. And that's when they saw it, the ruins of a city far in the distance. But this city wasn't entirely abandoned, because in some of the buildings, faint flickering lights could be seen. Orun held his breath. "This place is more dangerous than we thought." Orun studied the flickering lights in the ruined city. "No matter what, we stay here tonight." He kept his eyes on the ruins. Jumping in without understanding this place would be reckless. Ravik frowned. "If we stay here, we'll get a chance to observe what's happening in the city. But that also means they might notice us." The masked man nodded quietly. "It's risky but logical." The group set up a temporary camp in the ruins of the tower. Though broken and unstable, it still provided a high vantage point over the valley. As the sun sank beyond the horizon, the atmosphere grew heavier. Then the lights in the city began to move. The valley's silence didn't last long. The flickering lights in the city started shifting. At first, Orun thought they were just flames caught in the wind, but then he saw it. These lights were moving with purpose. Some drifted in a straight line, while others merged and then split apart. Something, or someone, was patrolling the ruins. "These aren't just flames," Ravik whispered. The masked man stared at the city. "Have they noticed us?" Orun took a deep breath. Something lived in the city. But were they living beings, or lost souls? Now it was time to find out who they were, and what they wanted. As Orun studied the shifting lights in the valley, he made a decision. "We need to know if they're aware of us." His voice was firm. "We'll leave a sign. If they react, it means they're thinking. If they ignore it, maybe they're just wandering aimlessly." Ravik frowned. "What kind of sign?" Orun picked up a few stones from the crumbling tower and carefully arranged them into a circular pattern. If something noticed the sign, it might change or break it, the masked man observed quietly. "If they respond, we might get an idea of how they think." Orun nodded. "Now we wait." As the night stretched on, all three of them kept their eyes on the marked area. As hours passed, the lights in the valley shifted. Some moved slowly through the city, while others flickered in place before vanishing. Then, one approached the marked area. Orun held his breath. The light paused. Then it moved slowly around the circle of stones, and then it did something. It picked up one of the stones and placed it outside the circle. Orun, Ravik, and the masked man watched in stunned silence. "Did you see that?" Ravik whispered. "That thing, it's aware." The masked man remained silent, while Orun, suppressing his tension, murmured, "It might be a message, but is it good or bad?" A mysterious entity had answered them. Now they had to decide what to do next. Orun studied the entity's response. "This is no coincidence." He stared at the stone placed outside the circle. Ravik nodded. "Definitely not. But is it a warning or an invitation?" The masked man spoke thoughtfully. "If we leave another sign, we might learn more about how they think." Orun nodded in agreement. "Exactly. We take another step and try to understand them." This time they didn't remove the first circle. Instead, they placed another sign next to it, a straight line. For an intelligent being, this could have meaning. If they touched the circle again, it meant the circle had significance to them. If they changed the line, it meant they were trying to communicate. If they ignored it, perhaps their actions were random after all. Orun stepped back, and all three waited in silence. Time passed slowly. The flickering lights in the valley continued their silent patrol. Then, one of them approached the marks again. Orun held his breath. The light circled the stones once more. First it touched the circle, but this time it put the stone back inside the ring. Then it stopped in front of the line, and it did something unexpected. It placed another stone beside it. Orun, Ravik, and the masked man exchanged stunned glances. Ravik's voice was a hushed whisper. "That thing, it's speaking to us." The masked man remained silent, while Orun's mind raced with possibilities. This entity wasn't just wandering aimlessly, it showed signs of intelligence. But the real question remained. Was it a friend or a foe? Orun watched the entity's reaction carefully. This might be an attempt at communication, but without understanding its message, responding could be dangerous, he said cautiously. Ravik sighed. "Are you afraid to speak to it?" "It's not fear. It's lack of information," Orun replied. "If it wants something from us, we need to know what. That's why we won't rush." The masked man nodded. "If we wait longer, they might leave more signs. That way, we can understand their thinking." Process. Orun and his team decided to observe through the night. As time passed, the movement of the lights became clearer. Some simply wandered through the city, but others seemed to be moving with purpose, traveling back and forth between certain areas. But the most interesting thing was what happened to the signs. That night, the marks changed 2 more times. First change, the second stone from the line was removed, and 3 new stones were placed instead. 2nd change, a new stone was added inside the circle. Ravik frowned. "Is this a language, or are they just testing us?" The masked man leaned in, studying the stones. If they're testing, they're doing it within a pattern. That means conscious thought. Orun realized they had learned a great deal just by waiting. These entities were aware. But what did they want? The night's observations had given Orun enough information. These entities were intelligent. They had a pattern. And most importantly, they seemed to be guiding them towards something. As the sky turned grey with the coming dawn, Orun made his decision. Watching is no longer enough. At sunrise, we go into the city. Ravik shrugged. Makes sense. But we don't know if daylight changes anything. What we saw might only happen at night. The masked man nodded. But in daylight, the shadows are shorter, and some things only come out in the dark. Orun smirked. Then let's see who's still here in the light. They packed up, checked their weapons, and descended into the valley. Orun and his team walked cautiously through the ruined city's entrance. The city was a graveyard of broken buildings. Time had slowly buried it in decay, and yet something here still lived. The lights they saw at night were gone, but in their place a strange presence filled the air. It was heavy. It was silent. Ravik took a step forward, scanning the area. Something is here. Can you feel it? Orun felt it too. This place wasn't empty, but whatever was here was different. Then he noticed something. Marks on some of the buildings, as if someone had lived here. But the signs weren't fresh. They belonged to the recent past. The masked man approached a wall and touched it lightly. These are old markings. Whose markings? Orun asked. Then a sound they hadn't heard before broke the silence, the grinding of wheels on stone. Something was approaching. Orun and his team walked cautiously through the ruined city's entrance. The city was a graveyard of broken buildings. Time had slowly buried it in decay, and yet something here still lived. The lights they saw at night were gone, but in their place a strange presence filled the air. It was heavy. It was silent. Ravik took a step forward, scanning the area. Something is here. Can you feel it? Orun felt it too. This place wasn't empty, but whatever was here was different. Then he noticed something. Marks on some of the buildings, as if someone had lived here, but the signs weren't fresh. They belonged to the recent past. The masked man approached a wall and touched it lightly. These are old markings. Whose markings? Orun asked. Then a sound they hadn't heard before broke the silence, the grinding of wheels on stone. Something was approaching. Ravik turned to Orun the moment the figure was gone. Are we following it? Or staying away? The masked man murmured, deep in thought. Was that a person, or something else? Orun still wasn't sure if what they had seen was supernatural, but one thing was certain. This figure knew the city's secrets, and if there was any survivor left in this place, this might be their best clue. Orun took a deep breath, choosing to gather more information rather than making a hasty decision. We don't know enough to follow it. He kept his voice low. We don't know what it is, where it's going, or even what kind of being we're dealing with. If it's a trap, I don't want to walk straight into it. Ravik gripped the hilt of his sword impatiently. But did that thing notice us? The masked man shook his head. We don't know, but one thing is certain. That figure wasn't wandering aimlessly. It had a purpose. Orun tried to recall every detail they had seen. The carriage moved on its own. The cloaked figure never revealed its face. But it had stopped and listened. What did that mean? And most importantly, who or what could still be alive in this city? For now we won't follow it, but we'll observe the city further to understand what we're dealing with, Orun said firmly. Instead of tracking the carriage's path, Orun and his team explored different parts of the city. As they moved, certain details stood out. Ancient symbols on the walls, mysterious markings, possibly the remnants of the city's former inhabitants. Strange mechanical remnants. The city wasn't entirely primitive. Some structures had traces of ancient machinery, footprints near the carriage path, human-sized but unnaturally precise. The masked man studied the tracks and whispered, "These aren't natural. They're straight like machine imprints, but the shape is human." Orun sighed. "Whoever or whatever these things are, they don't walk like us." That meant two possibilities. Either this was the last remnant of an old civilization, or something else had taken over. One thing was clear, the glowing lights at night weren't just ghosts. Something still walked this city. Orun studied the symbols on the walls. This city was once something completely different, he muttered. These markings were left by its former inhabitants. If we can understand them, we can learn the city's true purpose, Ravik frowned. But symbols alone won't tell us much. The masked man stepped closer, running his fingers over the engravings. These aren't just random drawings, he murmured. This might be a writing system, but it's unlike anything we've seen before. Some symbols were connected to one another. Some formed spirals, circles, and sharp lines. But the most interesting part, some symbols were located near mechanical ruins. Orun realized this couldn't be a coincidence. These might be related to technology, he said excitedly. If they're linked to old machinery, something was built here. Orun and his team continued investigating the strange mechanical remnants. Inside a collapsed building, they found an ancient but complex structure, a massive circular gear system, rusted metal panels, and a control panel covered in engravings. The masked man studied the inscriptions. This is unlike any technology we know. Orun ran his fingers over the control panel's carvings. They match the city's symbols. A moment of silence followed. Then, Orun accidentally pressed a button. A hidden mechanism activated. A deep rumbling sound echoed across the city. Metallic creaks and distant mechanical clicks filled the air. Ravik immediately grabbed his weapon. What did you do? Even Orun didn't know for sure. But one thing was clear, this city wasn't entirely dead, and now that they might have woken something up. Orun listened to the mechanical sounds echoing from the depths of the city. Staying here is risky, but running away blindly is worse, he said. We need to understand what's changed first. Ravik frowned. I don't like this. You activated something and we don't know what. The masked man nodded quietly. But we know we caused an effect. If we leave now, we may never get this chance again. Orun began carefully scanning the area. And then he noticed. The air had changed. The city was no longer as silent as before. The wind carried a faint metallic clatter. Some of the building walls were shifting, almost imperceptibly. And the most unsettling part, some parts of the city were lighting up. Orun and his team continued to observe. Some of the ruins were clearly moving now. Certain walls had symbols glowing faintly. A low, almost imperceptible vibration ran through the city. Dim lights flickered in places where none had existed before. The masked man spoke calmly. These weren't here before. Is this city waking up? Ravik shook his head, irritated. If something is waking up, that can't be good. Orun watched the lights appearing within the buildings. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, as if something deep within the city was trying to send them a message, and then a deep, powerful echo rang out from the distance. The awakened are returning. Orun felt a chill crawl down his spine. Who or what was returning? When Orun heard the deep echo from the city's depths, his instincts told him one thing: we need to follow it. We're following the sound, he said firmly. Leaving this city without knowing what has awakened would be like walking blind. Ravik sighed. With all the strange things happening, now we're following voices too? The masked man silently agreed with Orun. This could be our greatest clue, but we have to be cautious. The city now felt more alive than before. Orun and his team moved past the glowing buildings, heading toward the source of the echo. The ground vibrated faintly. The air had turned colder, and the voice seemed to be calling them toward the city's heart. Orun and his team arrived at a massive plaza where stone and metal blended together. This was the most intact structure they had seen in the city, so far at the center stood a large circular platform. Its surface was covered in the same ancient symbols they had seen before, and most importantly, there was a figure standing at its core. The figure had its back turned. It wore a long, ancient but ornate cloak. Around it, faintly glowing mechanical rings rotated slowly. Orun's breath caught. Was this a human, or a being fused with the city itself? Ravik gripped his sword. Are we ready for this? He whispered. Then the figure spoke. I'm glad you arrived before it was too late. Orun's skin tingled. This thing had been expecting them, and how did it know they were here? Orun took a deep breath and decided to speak directly to the figure. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice strong and clear. "What is happening in this city?" The figure slowly turned. Its face was partially masked, but its eyes, they were not human. They burned with deep blue light. Orun, Ravik, and the masked man stood ready, but the figure made no threatening moves. "How you are among the forgotten," the figure said, its voice neither warm nor cold, a voice that seemed timeless. "But now, it is time to remember." Orun frowned. "What do you mean?" The figure touched the floating mechanical rings around it. Symbols glowed, and suddenly the city began to change. Dust and ash rose into the air, walls rebuilt themselves, structures stood tall once more, and Orun saw a vision from long ago. This city was once a luminous metropolis. People in strange garments walked its streets, but then the sky darkened, and an immense shadow swallowed the entire city. Orun's eyes widened. "Is this a memory?" The figure nodded. "Yes, a reflection of the forgotten," Ravik growled. "What? Are you trying to tell us?" The figure stepped forward. "You are here, so you do not share this city's fate." Orun's blood ran cold. Was this a warning? Orun stepped forward cautiously, keeping his eyes locked on the glowing figure. "You say we must understand this city," he said, "but first we need to know who you are." The figure remained silent for a moment. Then its floating mechanical rings pulsed with a brighter glow. "I am a reflection that time has forgotten." It said, "I was created by this city. I am its voice, its mind." Ravik frowned. "Are you a spirit? Or are you the city itself?" The figure tilted its head slightly. "Neither, and both." Orun felt something click into place. This was not a human, but it was not a ghost either. This place was a remnant of a lost civilization, and this being was its lingering consciousness. Orun took a deep breath. "What happened to this city?" The figure lifted its head slightly, and then the surroundings shifted again. Mechanical gears turned, symbols on the walls glowed, and the city came back to life. Orun and his team witnessed another vision, but this time like they saw before the fall. The city was once a radiant civilization. Its people lived in harmony with the machines. But then, something came from the skies. Something unseen by human eyes but felt by their souls. And the city slowly turned into a curse. The figure turned to Orun. "You can share this fate too." Orun's chest felt heavy. "What are you trying to tell us?" The figure raised a hand and pointed toward the sky. It never fully left. A chill ran down Orun's spine. "Is it still following us?" The figure slowly nodded. "If you wish to survive in this world, do not repeat the past's mistakes." Ravik clenched his teeth. "How did this city fall? What mistake did they make?" The figure stepped back. "They awakened the wrong thing." And suddenly the ground trembled. When Orun felt the deep tremors shaking beneath the city, his instincts screamed one thing: "Get out now! We need to move! Now!" he shouted. "This place might be collapsing." Ravik gripped his sword tightly and nodded. "Finally, a smart decision," he said, quickly retreating. The masked man hesitated for a moment, then followed. "If this city is truly waking up, we shouldn't be here." Just then, the figure spoke again. "Fleeing is sometimes the wisest choice, but where you run is not always yours to decide." Orun barely had time to process the words before he and his team rushed to escape the city. The city was no longer the same. Every street they passed shivered, as if the buildings themselves were breathing. Cold mist rose from certain alleyways, i.e. Worst of all, the air felt charged with something unnatural. Ravik hesitated, glancing back. "Are we being followed?" he asked, breathless. Orun narrowed his eyes, scanning the ruins. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. Something was watching them. And then from the heart of the city, a deep metallic hum echoed outward, as if something massive and mechanical was awakening. The masked man picked up speed. "Run! We can't stay here!" Orun didn't look back. The growing metallic hum and the shaking walls told him all he needed to know. "Don't stop! No matter what, we have to get out of this city," he shouted. Ravik and the masked man followed without hesitation. The streets were shifting. The shadows of the buildings seemed to move, and the energy in the air was getting thicker. Orun felt his instincts screaming. This was no longer a city. It was a trap. At a crossroads, every path looked equally dangerous. Then a faint light shone from a narrow passage ahead. "That must be the exit," Ravik shouted. But they were running out of time because from the heart of the city, a massive mechanical footstep echoed, and it was getting closer. Orun and his team pushed themselves harder, running toward the light, but the city itself seemed to resist their escape. The ground below groaned, metal scraping against metal. The streets sealed themselves shut, walls rising to block their path. Orun gritted his teeth, but didn't stop. Just as they reached the passage, a massive shadow loomed behind them. A mechanical entity from the city's depths. Its limbs were long, impossibly fast, and its glowing blue eyes burned like the figures. "Move!" Orun roared, diving through the passage. Ravik and the masked man jumped in after him. Just as they cleared the exit, the stone walls behind them collapsed. Orun hit the ground hard, but quickly rolled back to his feet. He scanned the surroundings. They were outside the city now. But were they really safe? Ravik leaned against a rock, catching his breath. What was that thing? The masked man stared back at the ruined passage. Not a city, but a living entity. Orun forced himself to stay calm, and it didn't want to let us go. Now, a new unknown stretched before them, and the biggest question remained, where should they go next? As Orun listened to the sound of the collapsing stone behind him, a strange unease settled in his chest. Yes, they had escaped the city. But that didn't mean the danger was over. "We can't stay here," he said firmly. "We're not far enough yet. The city might have let us go, but we can't trust that." Ravik, still breathless, nodded. "You're right, that place felt alive. How do we know it actually let us leave?" The masked man scanned the surroundings. "We need a place to hide, but first, we should put several miles between us and that city." Orun led them further away, pushing toward the open plains beyond the valley. Nothing seemed to follow them, but something could be felt. It was as if the city had allowed them to leave, but was still watching. Orun and his team left the ruins behind and stepped into the open plains. Here the jagged cliffs of the valley gave way to vast, empty landscapes, but this created a new problem. There was nowhere to hide. After hours of walking, they finally took shelter beneath a rock formation. Ravik slumped against a boulder. "All right, at least we can breathe for a moment." Orun thought back to everything they had just escaped, that mechanical entity. Did it actually try to attack them, or did it simply want them to stay? The masked man hesitated, then asked, "Did you notice? Its eyes? They were the same as the figures." Orun nodded. "I don't know if that figure told us the truth, but one thing is clear. That city wasn't dead." Then, the wind suddenly stopped, and a faint but rhythmic tremor pulsed through the ground. Ravik sat up instantly. "What was that?" The masked man narrowed his eyes. "They didn't actually let us go." Orun gripped the hilt of his sword. Something, or someone, was approaching. Orun felt the tremors growing stronger. This wasn't natural. Something had found them. Orun drew his sword. "We're not running. If they're following us, that means a fight is inevitable." Ravik grinned, gripping his axe. Finally, the masked man, however, remained cautious. "We don't know what we're up against. Maybe we should try to talk first." But there was no time. A metallic screech tore through the silence of the plains, and then a figure emerged from beyond the horizon. Orun tried to make out its shape. This was a mechanical being, but it was different from what they saw in the city. Its body was humanoid, but its joints were metal. Its legs sparked slightly as it moved. And most importantly, its eyes weren't blue. They burned with a fiery orange glow. Ravik scowled. "That's a war machine," the masked man whispered coldly. "But who does it belong to?" Orun realized the figure was picking up speed. Then, like a storm, it charged toward them. It was a hunter, and it had found its prey. Orun hesitated before attacking. Was this entity just a hunter, or did it have a purpose? We should try to understand. "It first," he shouted. "If it's here for us, there must be a reason." Ravik gripped his sword. "And what if its reason is to kill us?" The masked man narrowed his eyes. "If it can speak, then it may have intelligence." Orun raised his hands and called out, "Stop! Who are you?" The entity didn't slow down at first, but at the last moment it halted just a few meters away. A cloud of dust rose. The entity stood still, tilting its head slightly, as if it was analyzing. Then a metallic voice echoed, "Permission granted to identify you. Resistance will result in termination." A chill ran down Orun's spine. Was this a threat? Or a warning? Ravik whispered. "This thing follows orders." The masked man nodded. "It's not fully conscious. It's on a mission." Orun took a deep breath. "Then we need to answer one question. What is its mission?" He spoke again. "Who decides what we are? Who commands you?" The entity paused for a few seconds. Then it lifted its head. "This information is beyond your clearance," Ravik growled. "It won't tell us anything." But Orun noticed something. The entity hadn't attacked. It was testing them. Maybe if they passed this test, it wouldn't be forced to kill them. Now Orun had to make a choice. As the entity's cold, mechanical voice echoed, Orun felt one thing: danger. This thing was either testing them or buying time. And if it was truly a hunter, it wouldn't let them live. "We attack!" Orun shouted, raising his sword and charging forward. Ravik grinned, gripping his axe. "Finally, let's tear this thing apart." The masked man hesitated, but seeing that the fight was inevitable, he drew his daggers. The first strike had to be theirs. Orun rushed in with all his strength. His sword swung downward in a powerful arc, but the entity moved with blinding speed, leaping backward. It wasn't just a machine. It was a war machine. Its fiery orange eyes flickered as it dodged, analyzing their movements. Then it struck back. Its thin yet deadly metal arms lashed out at incredible speed. Orun barely dodged, but a spark flew from the edge of his sword. If he had been even a second slower, the blow would have landed on his chest. Ravik roared, swinging his axe, but the entity ducked under the attack and suddenly jumped high into the air. The masked man whispered, "It's studying us." Orun steadied his breath. This wasn't a duel, this was a fight for survival. Now they had to choose a strategy. Orun gripped his sword tightly but didn't attack. The entity was fast. The entity was strong. But most importantly, it was watching them. "Hold!" Orun shouted. "Don't attack yet. Watch it!" Ravik grumbled but pulled back. "This better be worth it." The masked man seemed to understand what Orun was doing. This thing may be built for war, but it's not perfect. And then they waited. The entity stood still for a few seconds. Then it made the first move. It lunged at Orun with incredible speed. Orun barely dodged, raising his sword to block, and that's when he noticed it. The entity attacked in a straight line, calculated, precise. Orun realized something important. This machine didn't fight like an organic enemy. It didn't act on instinct. It was following a system. Orun quickly backed away and yelled, "Its attacks follow a pattern." The masked man immediately started analyzing its movements. Then he nodded. "Yes, every time it strikes from the left, it immediately dodges to the right." Ravik gripped his axe. "If we know where it's going, we can set a trap." Orun's mind raced. They had an advantage now. This machine wasn't perfect. Now they had to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Orun studied the entity's attack pattern in his mind. It always dodged right after striking left. That was a weakness. "Ravik," Orun called, "we can use this. We'll set a trap." Ravik grinned. "Now that's my kind of plan." The masked man immediately caught on. "I'll distract it. You finish it." Orun laid out the plan. The masked man would distract the entity. Orun would force it to dodge right. And Ravik would land a killing blow. The plan was simple but had to be perfect. The masked man darted forward, striking rapidly with his daggers. The entity stepped back for a moment. That was when Orun struck. His sword slashed toward the entity's left side. Just as expected, the entity dodged right, and Ravik's axe was already waiting. Boom! The axe cleaved into the entity's chest. Its fiery orange glow flickered. The machine stumbled back. But it didn't fall. Ravik growled as the entity remained standing. "Damn thing is tougher than I thought." Orun controlled his breathing, watching closely. It was weakened, but it wasn't finished. Its glowing eyes flickered, and for the first time, it stepped back. Now they had a choice: finish it completely, or see if it would let them go. Orun held his sword up but didn't strike. The entity was weakened. Its fiery orange glow flickered, but it wasn't attacking anymore. Was this a mistake, or a choice? Ravik raised his axe, stepping forward. "We can finish this. Why are we waiting?" Orun lifted a hand, stopping him. "Let's see what it does," the masked man nodded. If it wanted us dead, it would still be attacking. They all watched carefully. The entity stood motionless for a few seconds. Then, it slowly raised its head. "Analysis complete," it said in a mechanical voice. Identity confirmed. Orun's eyes widened. "Confirmed?" Ravik frowned. "What does that mean?" "You are not identified as targets," the entity said. Then, suddenly, it began stepping backward. The Gimei entity backed away, its glowing eyes stabilizing. Orun instinctively tightened his grip on his sword but didn't attack. "Is it leaving?" Ravik asked, still tense. The masked man watched its movements. "It looks like it wasn't here to kill us, just to test us." The entity stepped back further. Then it paused for a moment and tilted its head slightly. "Response required?" it asked. Orun hesitated. If this thing no longer saw them as a threat, this was their chance to speak. But could it be trusted? Orun saw the entity pulling back and knew this was his chance. He lowered his sword slightly, but remained. "Alert! I understand that you were testing us," he said firmly. "But who gives you orders? Who sent you here?" The entity stood motionless, as if it was processing how to respond. Then its mechanical voice rang out. "Your clearance level does not grant access to this information," Ravik growled. "Of course! Let's just finish it off." Orun held up a hand to stop him. "It's talking. We can learn more." The masked man studied its movements. "It won't tell us who commands it, but maybe we can figure out how it works." Orun took another step forward. "Why did you test us? What do you want from us?" The entity hesitated. Then, for the first time, it spoke in a way that sounded more like an explanation than an order. "Mission. Identify those who are in harmony." Orun's breath caught. "In harmony?" the masked man whispered. "That figure in the city warned us. Something changed them before the city fell. If this machine is searching for harmony..." Ravik narrowed his eyes. "Maybe it thought we were one of them." Orun pressed further. "Who are the ones in harmony?" But the entity stepped back. "Interrogation complete. Data transfer required." Orun frowned. "What data transfer?" The entity lifted its head toward the sky. "They know." Then, without warning, its eyes shut. All systems deactivated. The machine collapsed motionless to the ground. Orun and his team stood over the now lifeless machine. Ravik grumbled, slinging his axe over his back. "Really? As soon as it starts talking, it shuts down?" The masked man knelt beside it, pressing a hand against its metallic face. "I don't think this was an error. When it reached a point where it couldn't share more, it shut itself down." Orun watched the faintly blinking lights on its metallic frame. This was a war machine. But more than that, it was an observer. And what it said was disturbing. They know. Who? Who was watching them? And more importantly, what were those in harmony? Orun focused on the small blinking light still active on the machine's body. It was shut down, but not entirely. "We're not leaving this here," he said firmly. "This machine gathered data on us. Maybe we can do the same." Ravik frowned. "You want to carry it? Damn thing is almost as heavy as I am." The masked man, however, took a different approach. "We don't need to reactivate it. We just need to see if anything is stored inside." Orun nodded. "First, we check for data. If we find something useful, we take it with us." The masked man noticed a faint vibration in the machine's chest panel. This could be its core. Orun knelt down, placing his hand on the cold metal surface. It was freezing, but he could feel a mechanism still operating inside. Suddenly, a dim light pulsed. A mechanical voice echoed, "Unauthorized access. Limited data unlocking." Ravik jumped back. What the hell was that? But then a projection appeared before them. A blurry but slowly clearing hologram materialized. In the image, tall, dark silhouettes stood together. They looked human, but they were shrouded in shadow. Synchronization achieved, a mechanical voice announced. Then another figure appeared. It was different from the others, larger, more imposing, and its eyes glowed with blue light. Orun's heartbeat quickened. Was this the same figure from the city? The hologram distorted and suddenly cut off. Orun tried to process what he had just seen. What was that? Ravik muttered. The masked man exhaled slowly. I think those in Harmony weren't just humans. Orun knew. They couldn't leave this machine behind. They had to take it. If this thing was connected to the city, and if they truly knew, then they were caught in something much bigger than they had realized. Orun stared at the deactivated machine one last time and made his decision. We're taking it with us, he said firmly. Ravik frowned. Great. Now we're carrying a steel corpse. The masked man inspected the machine's connection points. If it was truly dangerous, it wouldn't have shut itself down. Orun knew this wasn't a simple choice. This machine held information, and if its words were true, they already knew. If this thing had sent a warning, then they were already being watched. That meant they had to uncover its secrets before it was too late. Orun and his team needed a safe place to transport and examine the machine. Carrying. Head out in the open was too risky. We need to move somewhere safe, Orun said. Somewhere we can open it without being exposed. The masked man nodded. If we tamper with it carelessly, we might trigger something dangerous. Ravik sighed. Fine. Let's find a rock to hide under. But I swear, if this thing explodes, I'm blaming you. Orun scanned the horizon and focused on a distant rocky area. It was one of the places they had seen while fleeing the city. There could be a cave or shelter there. We head that way, he said, leading his team forward. As the sun began to set, the group pushed toward the rocky terrain. The machine was strapped to Ravik's back, heavy but manageable, but the tension in the air was growing. The masked man suddenly halted. We're being followed. Orun's skin prickled. Are you sure? The masked man whispered. I can feel it, Ravik grumbled. Again? Can we ever get a break? Now, Orun had to decide. Should they keep moving toward the shelter or deal with whoever was behind them first? Orun slowed his steps, raising a hand. To stop his team. We won't rush, he whispered. We need to know who's following us first. The masked man narrowed his eyes. Good plan. If they're tracking us with intent, we can force them into a mistake. Ravik rested his axe lightly, on the ground. This better be worth waiting for. Orun took a step back, hiding among the shadows. Silence, only the faint hum of the wind against the rocks. Then, a movement. A figure emerged from the rocky terrain, moving slowly but with certainty. It was human-sized, but its steps were too measured, too deliberate. It wore a long, tattered cloak. Orun held his breath, watching closely. The masked man whispered, Just one person. Or at least, that's what it seems like. Ravik clenched his teeth. Any chance this thing is friendly? Orun had to trust his instincts. It was time to act. Orun held his breath, fists clenched. This figure was too careful. We keep watching, he whispered, pulling his team further into the shadows. The masked man nodded. If they're hostile, they'll reveal themselves. Ravik gripped his axe impatiently. You better be right about this. The figure shifted. Orun's first realization. They were not alone. The first figure tilted its head slightly, then stopped, and in that moment, a second shadow moved among the rocks. Orun's eyes widened. This could be a trap. The first figure slowly turned, looking directly toward where they were hiding. The masked man whispered, We might not have the luxury of waiting anymore. Orun held his breath, locking eyes on the figures. They might have set a trap, he whispered. But we'll strike first. The masked man gave a slight nod. If they're hostile, we need to be fast and silent. Ravik grinned, gripping his axe. Finally, no more waiting. Orun quickly devised a plan. The masked man would flank one target. Orun would move in as a distraction. Ravik would strike with full force when the time was right. Stay quiet, Orun whispered. Be fast. Then they moved. Orun slipped through the shadows, inching closer. The masked man moved like a phantom. Ravik stood ready, waiting for his moment. The first figure remained unaware, but the second suddenly shifted just then. The masked man struck. His dagger shot toward the first figure's neck, but the figure dodged at the last second. Orun's eyes widened. They had been expecting them. This was a trap. The first figure stepped back, drawing a sharp dagger. The second figure pulled a bowstring and fired an arrow. Orun dodged just in time, the arrow whizzing past his face. Ravik roared, swinging his axe. But as he struck, the first figure vanished. The masked man gritted his teeth. These aren't ordinary people. Orun quickly scanned the battlefield. Who were they, and why were they watching them? Now he had to make a decision. Orun gripped his sword tightly. This fight couldn't be for nothing. We need one alive, he shouted. The masked man nodded. Understood. We need to move fast. Ravik growled, tightening his grip on his axe. Fine, but if we waste time, they'll use it against us. The plan was simple. The masked man would strike fast to disorient them. Orun would pin one down. Ravik would block any escape. The masked man moved like a shadow, closing in on the first figure. His dagger flashed, but the figure was ready. Orun saw them stumble for just a moment and seized the chance. Lunged, grabbing their arm and forcing them down. Ravik blocked the second figure's escape. And then the first figure suddenly stopped struggling. A faint mechanical whisper echoed. Analysis complete. Orun's eyes widened. What? The first figure stopped resisting. When they pulled back their hood, what lay beneath was unexpected. Half metal, half human features. Your identity has been confirmed, they said in a hollow voice. Orun kept them pinned. Why were you following us? The figure narrowed its eyes at him. We're not the only ones watching you. A chill ran down Orun's spine. Who? The figure lifted its gaze toward the sky. They know you exist now. And then a familiar light flashed on the horizon. The same blue light from the city. Orun's jaw clenched. Was this the beginning or the end? Orun pressed the figure harder against the ground, eyes locked onto him. If you're not the only ones watching us, he said, voice firm, then who is? The figure narrowed its eyes at him. Then, in a cold, mechanical tone, it replied, They have noticed you, and they are interested. A chilling silence filled the air. Who? Are they? Orun pushed. The figure hesitated. Then, in a lower but clearer tone, it spoke. The eyes of eternity. The masked man immediately reacted. What does that mean? The figure tilted its head slightly. They see the past. They shape the future, and now they are watching you. Ravik growled. Enough riddles, just tell us plainly. Orun studied the mechanical features of the figure's face. Who are you? He asked. Why did you approach us? The figure lifted its head slightly. Then, in a deep and cold voice, it spoke. Daism, and adapted. Orun had never heard that term before. Adapted? The masked man remained silent, but his expression showed that this was important. The figure nodded. I was once human, but now I am bound. Orun felt a shiver run down his spine. Bound to what? The figure looked toward the sky. To them? To those who align with eternity. Orun took a deep breath. This figure called itself an adapted. Could this be related to what the figure in the city had warned them about? The masked man stepped forward. Who do they see as being in harmony? Us? The figure stared directly into Orun's eyes. Not yet, but you could be. Ravik clenched his axe in frustration. If you're hiding something from us, you're finished. The figure turned to Ravik and bowed slightly. I do not fear death, but there are things you are not meant to know. Orun had to ask one final question to learn more. Orun locked eyes with the figure. You and the ones like you, these adapted, who... Are you really? The figure tilted its head slightly. We are the ones who have broken free from the chains of the past. We were changed to adapt. The masked man listened carefully. Who changed you? The figure chose its words precisely. The eyes of eternity. Orun's chest tightened. For what purpose? The figure paused for a moment. Then it lifted its gaze toward the sky. To build the future. Orun narrowed his eyes. And the past? Why erase? The figure gave a faint smile. The past is weakness. For the adapted, only the future matters. Ravik slammed his axe against the ground. These people sound like brainwashed slaves, the masked man whispered. No, more like believers. Orun took a step back. This was bigger than he thought. Orun tried to process everything, but he needed to ask the real question. The eyes of eternity. Who are they? The figure stared at him and spoke clearly. They are the ones who see. Ravik growled. That doesn't explain anything. Orun pushed further. What do they see? The figure breathed deeply before answering. The past, as it was. The future, as it must be, the masked man whispered. A prophecy cult? Orun clenched. His fists. Why are they watching us? The figure leaned forward slightly. Because you have entered their world now. A heavy silence followed. Then the figure stepped back slightly. If you wish to live, you must accept them. If you resist, you will disappear. Orun's blood ran cold. If the eyes of eternity could truly shape the past and future, did that mean they had to obey them? Ravik clenched his teeth. Are you threatening us? The figure shook its head slightly. I am only telling the truth. Orun now had to decide. Orun studied the dull glint in the figure's eyes. This person was either a slave to their beliefs or a willing part of something much bigger. Either way, letting them go would be a mistake. We're not letting you go, Orun said firmly. You're coming with us. The figure showed no sign of surprise. Ravik clenched his teeth, lifting his axe. If you try to escape, I'll take your legs first. The masked man quickly tied the figure's wrists. If you're misleading us, you'll regret it. The figure, still eerily calm, simply said, You've made your choice, but there will be consequences. A chill ran down Orun's spine. Was this a threat or a warning? Night was falling. Orun and his team moved toward the rocky terrain, dragging the captive along. Ravik grumbled, We're already carrying a metal corpse and now a living one too? The masked man glanced at the figure. I'm not sure this person is normal. Orun thought the same. The figure showed no fear. They didn't act like a prisoner. They walked as if they belonged, as if they were meant to be here. That thought unsettled Orun even more. Then the figure spoke. What do you plan to do with me? Orun hesitated. Before answering, he needed his team's input. The masked man spoke first. We should take them somewhere safe and interrogate them properly. We don't know what's out there. Ravik gave a sharp look. Safe? I say we get the answers now. Orun felt torn between choices. Should they find a safe place to question the captive? Or should they press for answers immediately? Orun studied the figure closely. This person showed no fear nor any attempt to escape. That was either arrogance or true confidence. Forcing them to talk might not work. Instead, he needed to give them a reason to speak willingly. If you tell, ask the truth, Orun said. It could benefit you as well. The figure held his gaze, silent. The masked man spoke carefully. They will only talk if they have something to gain. Ravik scowled. And what exactly do you have to offer? Orun, locking eyes with the figure, spoke slowly. Your freedom. The figure tilted their heads slightly. Freedom, they whispered. Can you truly offer that? Orun answered clearly. If you talk, we'll release you. But if you hide anything, we will not be done with you, the masked man added. And if you lie, we'll know. The figure breathed in deeply. Very well, they finally said. Ask your questions. Orun decided to start with the most important one. Who are the eyes of eternity? Really? The figure paused for a moment. Then, in a clear voice, they spoke. They are the watchers. They observe time itself. Ravik groaned. That still sounds like a riddle. The figure continued. But do not mistake them for mere observers. They erase the past and shape the future. A chill ran through Orun's veins. How? The figure lifted their eyes to the sky. Those who are altered through time become one with eternity. Those who adapt are freed from the burdens of the past. And in doing so, the future becomes theirs to create, the masked man whispered. This is some kind of forced transformation. Orun's mind flashed back to the entities they encountered. In the city. If the eyes of eternity erased the past and changed people, what did that mean for them? Orun took a deep breath. He had to decide which question to ask next. Orun carefully weighed the figure's words. The eyes of eternity were not just observers. They erased the past to shape the future. But why? Orun stared into the figure's cold gaze and asked, what do the eyes of eternity truly want? Why do they need to alter the past? The figure breathed deeply, a faint expression flickering across their face. Because the past feeds chaos. Orun narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? The figure tilted their head slightly. Chaos is the natural state of man. Conflict, change, learning, all of it breeds suffering, the masked man whispered. They fear chaos. The figure turned toward him. No, they do not fear it. They know. It is unnecessary. A cold unease settled over Orun. What about free will, choice? Why is remembering the past such a threat? The figure smiled slightly. Because the past does not allow the future to be free. If you control the past, you guide the future. An eternal order. That is their ultimate goal. Orun held his breath. If this was true, then the eyes of eternity were not just a prophecy. Cult, they were architects of fate. And now one question terrified him the most. What about us? Why are they interested in us? The figure exhaled. Because you are misaligned. Orun blinked. What? The figure continued. Those who adapt let go of the past and flow into the future. But you carry the past. You resist. You defy. The masked man spoke coldly. So that's why they're watching us, to change us? The figure nodded slightly. Perhaps, but they may also decide you need to be removed. Ravik stepped forward angrily. Then why are you still talking? Are you here to betray us to them? The figure shook their head. No, I only speak the truth. If you wish to survive, you must decide. Orun's mind raced. If the eyes of eternity truly saw them as misaligned, they would either be transformed or destroyed. Orun clenched his fists, grinding his teeth. Run? Hide? Those were not options. The eyes of eternity were rewriting history, reshaping people, and they wanted to change him, his team, maybe the entire world to fit their order. He couldn't allow that. We won't hide, Orun said firmly. We'll fight back. Ravik grinned, his eyes burning with excitement. Now that's what I like to hear. The masked man, however, was more cautious. That means waging war on them. We don't know their resources, we don't know their numbers. Orun knew he was right. But one thing was certain. They had to take the first step. They had to find a way to strike at the eyes of eternity. The figure lowered his head slightly at Orun's decision. You people always make the same mistake. Orun shot him a sharp look. Do you know how to stop them? The figure was silent for a moment. Then his eyes lifted to the sky as he spoke. If you want to fight the eyes of eternity, you must find their weakness first. The masked man nodded. And every system has a weakness. Orun waited for the figure to speak carefully. Then tell us, he ordered. Where do we start? The figure took a deep breath. Their power is tied to a single source. Orun narrowed his eyes. What source? The figure bowed slightly. The core of time. Silence. Ravik grunted. And what the hell is that? The figure continued. The core of time is where the eyes of eternity rewrite history. It is where the future is reshaped. Orun's heartbeat quickened. And if we destroy it? For the first time the figure hesitated. Then he answered quietly. If the core is destroyed, everything falls apart. The masked man considered. Would it collapse their entire system? The figure nodded. Yes, but reaching it won't be easy. Orun knew this would be a challenge, but now they had a target. If they wanted to stop the Eyes of Eternity, they had to reach the core of time. Orun knew they couldn't win this war alone. The Eyes of Eternity were powerful enough to alter time itself. To stop them, they needed more warriors. We can't do this alone, he said firmly. We need allies. Ravik frowned. That could give them more time. The masked man was more cautious. But rushing in unprepared is suicide. The figure nodded slightly. If you seek allies, you must choose wisely. Orun narrowed his eyes. Who can help us? The figure took a deep breath and spoke. There are 3 groups who might resist the Eyes of Eternity. The ones in the shadows. They are those who have escaped the Eyes and guard the knowledge of the old world. Among them are sorcerers, historians, and those who understand the secrets of time, but earning their trust will be difficult. The warriors in the mountains. They once rebelled against the Eyes of Eternity, but were crushed. Now they hide in the mountains, waiting for revenge. But they have suffered heavy losses and trust no one. The Lost City. A legend speaks of a city that the Eyes of Eternity cannot control. Its people exist outside of time itself, but no one knows if the city truly exists. Orun had to choose one of the 3 allies. The ones in the shadows could provide knowledge. The warriors in the mountains could provide strength. The Lost City could hold the key to ending it all, but he couldn't go after all 3. He had to choose. Orun stayed silent for a moment. 3 paths lay before them. Knowledge, strength, or chasing a legend. The Lost City, he finally said. The masked man lifted his head slightly. If it isn't real, we waste valuable time. Ravik frowned. And if it is? Orun narrowed his eyes. Then we might find the key to stopping the Eyes of Eternity. They controlled the past. But if the Lost City truly existed beyond their reach, it might be beyond time itself, and that could be the most powerful weapon against them. The figure watched Orun carefully. You seek the Lost City? Orun nodded. Tell us how to find it. The figure took a slow breath. To understand that, you must first know why it disappeared. Ravik groaned. We don't need a story. Just tell us where to go. The figure turned to him. If I knew the exact path, I would already be there. The masked man nodded. But you have leads, don't you? The figure gave a slow nod. Legends say that the Lost City was once targeted for destruction by the Eyes of Eternity. Orun narrowed his eyes, but it wasn't destroyed. No, it hid. Orun leaned forward. How did it hide? The figure took a deep breath. The Lost City exists. In a place called Beyond the Gate. Ravik frowned. And what is that? The figure bowed slightly. A passage beyond time itself. Orun's breath caught. If a city exists outside of time, the Eyes of Eternity can't control it, the masked man whispered. That means if we reach it, we could understand how their power works. The figure lifted his head. But finding the gate won't be easy. Orun narrowed his eyes. Do you know where it is? The figure smirked. The gate isn't always in the same place, but it can only be opened under certain conditions. Orun took a deep breath. If they wanted to reach the Lost City, they had to unlock the gate. They needed to find the ancient key. The first requirement to open the gate. They needed to determine when the gate would open, to solve the mystery of time. They had to do both at once. First we find the ancient key, Orun said, but we also need to determine when the gate will open. The masked man nodded. Then we split up. If we search both at the same time, we'll gain an advantage, Ravik grumbled. Splitting up? I don't like it, but I don't want to waste time either. Orun quickly organized the team. Orun and Ravik would search for the ancient key. The key was hidden in an ancient temple, but the temple was rumored to be dangerous and well guarded. The masked man would study the gate's opening time. The answer lay in the signs of the past. Legends spoke of the gate opening when certain stars aligned, Orun's group would retrieve the key while the masked man deciphered the time. "Are you ready?" Orun asked. "Let's do this," Ravik said, gripping his axe. The masked man smirked. "I'll do my part." And so the two groups parted ways. Orun and Ravik traveled long before reaching the temple. The temple was a massive stone structure, surrounded by cracked pillars and ancient carvings. But when they arrived, they noticed something. The door was already open. Ravik frowned. "Someone got here before us," Orun scanned the surroundings. "We're not alone." Before entering, they needed to be prepared. Meanwhile, the masked man studied the sky and ancient inscriptions. The legends spoke of a specific time when the gate would open, and that time might be approaching. As soon as he spotted the first sign, a chill ran down his spine. Tonight, the gate could open, but Orun and Ravik still hadn't found the key. Time was running out. The masked man studied the stars and ancient inscriptions carefully. The legends spoke of a specific time frame when the gate would open, but something was wrong. "This can't be happening," he whispered. The celestial alignments were occurring faster than expected. The gate was opening sooner than planned. "I need to warn Orun." He quickly lit a signal flare, sending a fiery symbol into the sky. Orun and Ravik, still watching the temple entrance, suddenly noticed the glowing signal. "That's the masked man's warning," Orun said. Ravik frowned. "What's he trying to tell us?" A sinking feeling settled in Orun's chest. The gate might be opening early. This meant everything had changed. Now, Orun faced two major dilemmas. The ancient key was still inside the temple, but someone else had arrived first. The gate might be opening early, which meant the masked man could be in danger. Ravik gripped his axe impatiently. "What's the move? If we leave without the key, we can't open the gate." Orun had only seconds to decide. Orun stared at the temple for a brief moment. The key was inside, but if the gate was opening, he needed to be there. "Forget the key, Ravik." "We're moving now," he ordered. Ravik scowled. "What? How do we open the gate without it?" "If the gate is already opening, maybe the key doesn't matter anymore." Orun's voice was firm. Ravik hesitated, then gripped his axe. "Fine, but if this is a waste of time, you owe me." Orun rushed toward the masked man's signal, Ravik right behind him. The race to the gate had begun. Orun and Ravik descended from the rocky cliffs, spotting the masked man standing on a stone platform. He was staring at the sky, and the sky was changing. A golden blue light shimmered in the air. Orun's breath caught. "Is that the gate?" The masked man nodded. "It's opening, but we're not alone." Orun's eyes darted around. Then he saw them. Agents of the Eyes of Eternity. 3 shadowed figures watched the gate's formation. "They know we're here," the masked man whispered. Ravik gritted his teeth. "If they go in, we're going in too." Gate was fully forming. Golden energy rippled as a passage took shape. One of the shadowed figures stepped into the gate first. Orun's mind was racing. They couldn't miss this chance. Orun didn't hesitate. "We're going in!" he shouted and sprinted toward the gate. Ravik and the masked man followed. One of the shadowed figures had already stepped through, and without wasting a second, Orun plunged into the shimmering light. The world vanished instantly. For a moment, Orun felt like he was floating. There was no ground, no time. Everything swirled in golden ripples. Ravik's voice echoed, "What the hell is this?" The masked man, spinning through the void, whispered, "It's not real, yet it is." Orun noticed a shimmering path ahead, and then a massive structure appeared before them. "The lost city," he whispered. As they stepped through the gate, they found themselves in a vast city. The sky was an endless shade of grey and gold. The city looked ancient yet untouched, but it was empty. Ravik took a few steps. "Why is it so quiet?" The masked man knelt. "There are tracks. Someone is here." Then a figure emerged in the distance. Orun held his breath. The agents of the Eyes of Eternity were here too, but behind them stood another person, a citizen of the lost city. Now Orun had to decide if this stranger was friend or foe. Orun didn't hesitate when he saw the Eyes of Eternity's agents. This journey had been shadowed by them from the beginning. And now letting them roam freely would be a mistake. We need to stop them, he said firmly. Ravik grinned, raising his axe. Finally, the masked man nodded. We need to be quick and silent. We don't want to draw too much attention. But it was too late. The eyes of Eternity's agents had already noticed them, and they were ready to strike. 3 enemies. The first moved like a shadow. Orun realized he was a tracker for the eyes of Eternity. He was the most dangerous, because he would never let them escape. The second was a heavily armored warrior. His strength and durability were his main assets, likely the hardest to bring down. The third was a sorcerer. He would likely cause the most damage, but he was also the most vulnerable. Orun had to pick the best target first. Orun knew the sorcerer was the biggest threat. If they could take him down before he cast his spells, they would. Have the advantage. Take out the sorcerer first, he shouted. Ravik, gripping his axe, charged forward. Got it. The masked man melted into the shadows. Keep him busy, I'll find an opening. The sorcerer raised his hands as they approached. You defy time itself, he whispered. Then blue flames erupted in the air. The sorcerer rose into the air, surrounded by swirling blue fire. Orun felt something was wrong. This was no ordinary magic. The sorcerer was channeling the power of the eyes of Eternity. Watch out, Orun shouted. Just then the flames rushed toward them like a storm. Orun closely watched the sorcerer's movements. His power was coming from a specific point in the sky, a faintly shimmering blue energy ring. The sorcerer was drawing his magic from it. If I can break this, I can weaken him. Orun made his decision instantly. Ravik, masked man, distract him. I'll cut his power. Ravik, gripping his axe, nodded. Got it. The masked man disappeared into the shadows, sneaking toward the sorcerer. Orun focused on the glowing energy ring and trusted his instincts. Orun searched for a way to disrupt the source. But physically reaching it was impossible. Unless it didn't need a physical attack. This was magic, and every spell had a balance. Orun focused on the energy within himself. Within seconds, a warmth spread through his fingertips. If I can disrupt this, the spell collapses. But he had no idea how dangerous this would be. Then the sorcerer noticed his plan. You are trying to interfere with the flow of time, he whispered, and then he launched a wave of energy toward Orun. But Orun didn't retreat. Now or never. He focused all his will and reached toward the glowing blue source. The energy shook violently. Orun's mind was suddenly filled with whispers. This wasn't just a magic source. It was connected to time itself. If he disrupted it, he wouldn't just stop the spell. He could alter time's flow in this area. Orun focused all his energy on the blue power source. I have to destroy it completely. Electricity rushed through his body. The energy reacted to his presence. The sorcerer's eyes widened in fear. Stop! You don't know what you're doing. But it was too late. Orun raised his hands and unleashed his power. Boom! The air shook, the energy shattered, and for a moment, the world stopped. Orun collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The sorcerer fell from the sky, screaming before crashing into the ground. But something was wrong. The sky began to crack like glass. Ravik, staring in shock, muttered, That's not normal. Orun, what did you do? The masked man exhaled sharply. I think we broke time. The city started flickering, one moment there, the next gone. The sorcerer weakly lifted his head. You made a mistake, he whispered. And then he began to fade. Orun jumped to his feet. We need to get out of here. But where? Time itself was no longer stable. Orun felt the world around him shake and ripple. The city was rewinding one moment, speeding forward the next. Time is broken, the masked man murmured. Ravik angrily kicked a rock. All right, Orun, how do we get out of this? But Orun wasn't thinking about escape. No, if we run, this destruction continues. We have to fix it. The masked man stared at him. You want to stabilize time? How? Orun took a deep breath. The shattered blue energy source had collapsed, but in its place tiny glowing fractures appeared in the air. They rippled like holes in a river, disrupting the flow of time. The masked man reached toward one and shuddered, as it trembled beneath his touch. These are rifts in reality, Orun focused. If he could close these fractures, he could stabilize the city and stop time from collapsing. But how? Orun focused on the cracks in time. If he could seal them, time would return to its natural flow. But the cost could be immense. The masked man asked anxiously. "How are you going to do this?" Orun whispered, searching for an answer within himself. "Balance. I need to restore balance." Ravik frowned. "Balance? What are you talking about?" Orun lifted his hands, feeling the energy around him. Orun felt a vibration within his soul. It was a reflection of the energy he had absorbed when destroying the sorcerer's power. But now, he had full control. If he directed his energy into the fractures, he could seal them, but it would drain him and possibly injure him severely. Worst case. Orun's existence could be pushed outside of time itself. The masked man watched him carefully. "If you fail, we may not be able to bring you back." But there was no other choice. Orun gathered all his willpower and focused his energy. The first crack sealed, and the city trembled less. The second crack sealed, and the sky's fractures began to fade. The third crack sealed, and Orun felt something break inside him. His body felt heavy, as if it were being pulled into time itself. But he didn't stop. One more. As he directed his final surge of energy, his vision blacked out, and everything went silent. Orun found himself collapsed on the ground. Time was no longer breaking. The city was stable, but something had changed. The sorcerer's body was completely gone. The sky was no longer cracked, but its color had shifted. The gate was still open, but it seemed to lead somewhere different. The masked man shook him awake. "Orun, are you alive?" Orun opened his eyes and took a heavy breath. "I think we did it." But had they really succeeded? Now a new mystery lay ahead. Orun felt exhausted, but his curiosity was stronger. "This city has changed. We need to understand why," Ravik grumbled. "I think we should leave while we still can." The masked man examined the surroundings carefully. "No, Orun is right. We sealed time, but this place, it's different now." "Then let's find out why," Orun said, stepping deeper into the city. The city felt more intact and eerie. Buildings looked stronger rather than crumbling. The streets were dusty and old, but it felt as if no one had walked here in ages. Ravik muttered, "Someone should have lived here. But where is everyone?" The masked man approached a wall, studying the ancient symbols. Then he froze. These markings, they weren't here before. Orun took a deep breath. This wasn't just a remnant of the past. This was an echo of time itself. Suddenly the air grew cold, and then a whisper. "Time has shifted." "Who has come?" Ravik drew his blade. "This isn't normal." Orun studied the surroundings. These weren't people. They were echoes of the city's past. Everything that had ever happened here left an imprint in time. And now, they had disturbed it. Orun took a deep breath and focused on the darkness ahead. These whispers, they meant something. "We follow them," he said firmly. Ravik scowled. "If this gets us cursed, I'm blaming you." The masked man studied the shifting shadows. "Echoes of time always show something, but do you want to see it?" Orun stepped forward, following the voices. The whispers led them to the oldest part of the city. Narrow streets, crumbling statues, and ancient temples surrounded them. But something felt off. Their footsteps echoed, but sometimes the echoes sounded different. The shadows seemed still, but when not looking directly, they shifted. When the cold wind blew, the whispers became clearer. "Time, the forgotten ones. Can you see us?" Orun held his breath. "Yes, we are here." Orun's words hung in the air. Then her figure appeared before them, a translucent, shadow-woven being, but it stood like a human, its features visible. "You stopped the breaking of time, but you have not yet understood the city's secret," the voice said sorrowfully. Ravik gripped his sword. "Is this a trap?" the masked man quickly answered. "No, this is an echo, a memory." Orun stepped closer. "Why is this place like this? What happened here?" The being lowered its head. "This city, was never meant to exist. The figure lifted its hands, and the city trembled. Suddenly, everything changed. Buildings shimmered, their cracks disappearing. The streets filled with people, but they were memories. The air rang with echoes of a past age. Orun stared in awe. This place was trapped in time. The eyes of eternity. "Saw us," the figure whispered, "and they erased us from time itself." Orun stood frozen. This city had been cast outside of time, and the eyes of eternity had made sure no one would ever remember it. But now, they were here, and that could change everything. Orun stepped closer to the ghostly figure. "Why did the eyes of eternity destroy this place?" he asked. The figure slowly raised its head. "Because this city held their greatest secret." Orun's heartbeat quickened. The figure lifted its hands and the sky shimmered. Orun and his team felt as if they were looking into another time. The city was alive. People walked the streets. A glowing sphere pulsed in a temple. A small group of people gathered around it. The figure spoke softly. "We could read time. We saw the past and the future as one," the masked man murmured in shock. "They could control time?" "No," the figure corrected. "We only understood it. But the eyes of eternity saw our knowledge as a threat." The figure lowered its head. "They wanted absolute control over time, but as long as we existed, they could never have it. So they erased us from history." The city suddenly changed. The sky darkened. People screamed. The agents of the eyes of eternity arrived and destroyed the glowing sphere. Orun could hardly believe what he saw. This city wasn't destroyed. It was removed from time itself, and the eyes of eternity never wanted this secret to be uncovered. The figure stepped closer to Orun. "You came here and restored balance. Now everything can change." Orun took a deep breath. This was a huge revelation. The eyes of eternity didn't control time, they only manipulated it. And if this city could return, their power might be broken forever. Orun took a deep breath. If this city returned to reality, the greatest secret of the eyes of eternity would be revealed. This city was cast out of time, but we can bring it back, he said firmly. Ravik frowned. "What does that even mean? How do we do that?" The masked man muttered to himself. "If this city once existed, its traces must still be here. Maybe we can anchor it back into reality." The spectral figure stepped closer. "If you do this, time itself will shift. The eyes of eternity will notice." Orun nodded. "I know, but we have no other choice." The city's removal from time was like a dried-up river, but the path of the river was still here. They needed to redirect the flow of time back to this place. They needed to find an anchor point. If they did this, the eyes of eternity would surely notice. Orun moved toward the city's center. There, an ancient ruined temple stood, and in the middle, a faint glowing light hovered. The masked man held his breath. This might be the city's connection to time itself. Orun reached toward the light. As Orun focused his energy on the light, the city flickered. Ravik gritted his teeth. "This feels strange." The spectral figure lifted its hands. "The city needs balance to return." Orun's mind was flooded with images. The city was once a knowledge hub. When the eyes of eternity came, they severed it from time. Now Orun was reversing that mistake. Just as Orun channeled his final energy into the light, the city started reappearing. In reality, the sky shimmered, sunlight returned. The streets became solid once more, but the sky flashed. A voice boomed from the void. "Who dares interfere with our work?" The eyes of eternity had noticed. Orun looked around. The city was returning. But the eyes of eternity would arrive soon. They could escape. But the city would still be vulnerable. They could fight, but they didn't know how strong the eyes of eternity were. They could find an alternative. Maybe hiding the city completely. Orun looked around quickly. The eyes of eternity were coming. But if the city vanished, they would never find it. "We can't fight, but we can make this place invisible." The masked man turned in shock. "You can't." "Trick them. They see time." Orun took a breath. "Then we won't show them time." The city had once been erased. Now it was back. and that meant it was part of time again. If Orun simply hid it, the eyes of eternity might find it later. But if he bent time itself, they would never know it existed. The spectral figure stepped closer. "Will you break time again?" Orun clenched his fists. "No, I will bend it." Orun focused on the glowing energy again, but this time, instead of making the city real, he pulled it into the spaces between time. A veil of time needed to be formed. The city would still be here, but unseen. The eyes of eternity would be completely fooled. Orun channeled all his energy, and the city began to shimmer. The sky rippled again. The buildings faded into mist, and the city disappeared. The voices of the eyes of eternity echoed through the air. But, now as there was nothing here, Orun took a deep breath. He had done it. The city still existed, but no one would ever see it again. The eyes of eternity will find nothing here. But Orun knows how dangerous it is to trick time. The city is hidden, but is it safe? Orun looked at the sky. "This is just the beginning," he whispered, and he walked away, leaving behind an invisible city. And so another story comes to an end. But was it just a story, or was there a hidden truth within? Who knows? If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more. See you in the next story.